Hi, my name is Grace Lee. I'm a piano teacher and the founder of NoteQuest app, but more about that later. I'm going to be talking and demonstrating some activities you can do to boost your students' IQ, that is, Intervallic Quotient, using the three senses: sight, sound, and touch. And thank you again to Nicola for inviting me to join you all for this brilliant conference of music teachers who truly have a passion for what you do. It's so inspiring for me to see folks come together in a global community just so that we can serve our students better. A bit about my own background. I've got degrees in piano performance and music education, but I must say that my research and study of sight reading has been a completely separate endeavor, not really covered in school. I remember doing worse than necessary during sight reading exams because I lacked a certain training and mindset. And it's been my mission to help in that cause. In just over 20 years of teaching in various settings, I've made some interesting observations about how students acquire note recognition and sight reading skills, and I've tried many different approaches. Much of it comes from my own experience as a teacher and as a student myself, who was stronger in the ears than I was at sight reading during exams. Learning what doesn't work has helped me understand what does work. And I'm still undoing things and finding new approaches to solve the same old problems. No matter what your level of experience is, and especially if you're a seasoned teacher, I believe it's important for us to still maintain an open mind and not always feel the need to rely on what we know or the way we were taught ourselves. Believe it or not, when we engage in sight reading, it's common to focus on sight and touch, but neglect the sound aspect of the training, which is a bit ironic. Because music as a whole is all about sound, isn't it? And yet, because we call it sight reading, it's easy to overlook the importance of the connection of the notation to the sound, specifically intervals and patterns we find in music. We're going to focus on how these three senses, again, sight, sound, and touch, can be used to make interval-based sight reading more effective. Many times, students come to us already being able to play by ear, but feel stunted in their sight reading ability, causing a lot of frustration. Other students have not had that much musical training or exposure at all, and they have trouble understanding how music is structured. This calls for trying a more multisensory approach. So let's get practical. I want to give you a good handful of activities that you can do right away with your students. My hope for this whole presentation is to show more than tell. So that's what you're going to get. The videos pretty much speak for themselves. These are pretty adaptable experiences that you can do during lessons, but some can be done off the bench as well, and many of these can be done in group classes. And also, you can do them if you teach online as well, and they're easily adaptable. Now, if I could make two important points about teaching sight reading. Whatever you plan, try to be aware of how much you're integrating these three senses: sight, sound, and touch. You're going to hear me say that a lot. And number two, practice or prescribe sight reading as a separate activity, daily or at least consistently. It's like hair growth. You can't see change from one day to the next, but over weeks and months, it becomes noticeable that it has grown. Like with many things, consistency is the key. I'm going to start with landmark notes as a bridge to intervals. Now why? Because that's where I like to start when introducing notation on the staff. Landmark notes, as opposed to traditional acronyms such as every good boy deserves fudge, EGBDF, help cut that extra time-consuming step. The landmarks point you directly to the note on the staff, allowing those to be the starting points to find other notes more easily and quickly. This also allows your students to become more self-sufficient learners. Once trained, and it will take time, being familiar with landmark notes is the fastest way to read intervals. Whether it's written music or music you hear. It doesn't matter what type of music we're talking about. It could be Bach or pop or jazz. Intervals are the building blocks of all music. In the interest of time, I won't go too deep into the commonly used landmark notes, but you can find them pre-built into the app and in many other resources. Those of us who teach landmark notes often introduce the famous landmarks we call the 3 C's. Around here, we call them middle C, cow C, and face C. I've adopted these clever names from my friend and colleague, Leela Viss. Here are two different activities and games we can do to reinforce the 3 C's. First, I'd like to show you how these landmark notes look in a basic flashcard format inside of NoteQuest. Again, you don't have to use an app for this. You can make your own flashcards for this very basic activity that probably many of you already do. Here's an example of how it's already built into the app. I'm going to choose landmark notes, and let's do the 3 C's. And I have to choose the correct one, or else it won't let me pass. With beginners, I might even introduce a whole body approach and introduce these 3 landmarks with body motions, such as face C, middle C, and at the knees, cow C, while also showing their place on the grand staff. Okay, so here's another one called point and play. This one exercises the sense of sight and sound. This is a really important tip that many of us often overlook. Many of us do these kinds of drills that I just showed you, flashcard apps, other games, which is great, but students really need to relate this to actual music. It's pretty surprising how often students can nail a regular flashcard set or a note speller and feel great about it, but then when you give them a real piece of music on the music stand, it doesn't always transfer to a real music reading situation. Do you identify with this? I certainly do. So here's a video clip of me doing point and play with a beginner student. And by the way, please disregard me calling it seek and play. I later renamed it point and play. We're going to do seek and play. So now when I point to it, you're going to play that one. Good. So simple, right? All we did was bring those same landmark notes and identify them in context to a real piece. This also is a wonderful way to prep a piece before actually learning it, because you're helping them set them up for more success and probably a little less stumbling around. We call this scaffolding in education. This is my student identifying the C's in Tall Giraffe in the Piano Safari Book 1. Okay, now here's another similar example, maybe for an early intermediate student or a transfer student. This one comes from Faber Performance 2B, and it shows a range of 5 C's. It's a piece called Chinese New Year. So you can easily do this in an online lesson or design it for a group class, as you can see. You can do a point and play or a point and say version, or both. You can do them at the same time. It's up to you. Landmarks by ear. So this one, we're going to exercise the sense of sound. Here's an activity that purely focuses on the ear training part of it. This is my student KJ, who in this video, he had only been taking lessons for 3 months. In a fun way, we were able to separate high register, middle register, and low register. This also helps build an early sense of audiation, or the ability to predict sounds, and ear training even from the very beginning. And it's so simple to do. We first introduce the note names, again, middle C, cow C, and face C. And you can do this with all other landmarks as well.
Cow C, wait. Middle?
Middle C.
High C, face C?
Good.
Middle C?
Good.
Cow C?
Very good. Turn around and high five. Okay, the next activity involves critical listening and interval ear training. I call it the interval relay game, but I've also called it interval baseball. And when you watch the clip, you're going to see why it could be called baseball. You can either do this one-on-one, as you'll see in this video example recorded a few years ago. I did this in a group class, and it was a lot of fun to do as a class because it encouraged active group participation. Start on D, and we're going to go like this. What do you think, guys? Should it get smaller or bigger?
Small.
Yeah, try again. Yay! Okay, Laura. Start on middle C. right. Second try is always good. All right. Okay, Eva. Start on A. What do you think?
Wider.
Oh, whoever said wider. Yeah. Next. E. Good. So now, after watching this video 4 years later, I realized that this would have been even better if I had the students identify the intervals as seconds or thirds. I think it would have been more educationally rich. This would help them learn which intervals they were hearing and playing at the same time. Next is my favorite new activity that involves an exclusive exercise in touch. Here's a clip from an Instagram post I shared earlier this year. It explains the whole thing in a nutshell. And it's really important because when we can get a good sense of touch on the piano keys, when we're sight reading, it causes us to be less reliant on looking down, of course, which is a very key skill. All right, so I kind of named this activity blind interval climber. So I would use either a blindfold or just have the student look away when they're doing this activity. So we'll start with intervals of seconds, and we're going to use fingers 3 and 2 in the bass. And as you can see, this is also a great opportunity to practice good technique. So using drop, lift, if you care about that at this stage. So in this activity, they can really kill 2 birds with 1 stone. And you can reinforce that as well. By the time you get to the middle, you're using 2, 3. So they switch as they do the upper half. Now, by week 2, they've graduated to thirds. So I'm going to have them use 3, 1. Right hand, 1, 3. And by the way, here's a pitfall that I found that a lot of students run into. They start doing this when they get to thirds. They'll stop and then they'll touch their fingers together, which is sort of like a crutch, right? So what we want to do is remove that crutch and encourage them to trust the process. Even if they make mistakes, it's totally fine. Just like any other activity where they're not used to, if they just do it again and again with some repetition, they'll get better at it and it'll feel more natural. So maybe then by the 4th week or so, they've graduated to fifths, so it's 5, 1. And so on. By the way, I found that this is such a terrific activity to help scaffold a pattern piece or rote piece they're working on. And a lot of times these rote pieces will focus on a particular interval, like one piece will really focus on fourths. So then that week I will say, go ahead and do the interval climber, the blind interval climber with fourths. So as you all know, looking down at your hands too much disrupts the sight reading process. So this activity is great for being able to play by touch. And it really exercises that sense of spatial awareness in the fingers, something that is easily neglected in the early learning stages. And it's certainly something that I used to neglect as well. It's become one of my favorites and a lot of other teachers as well that I introduced to. Here's an example of how NoteQuest has customized interval drill games in a sequential format. It starts with landmark notes, and then it releases other intervals for reading. So it starts, each exercise starts with a landmark note and it's connected to an interval. And this is all in a lightly gamified drill format where it's timed and tracked for you. You can choose seconds, thirds, or seconds and thirds mix, for example. And this kind of exercise is important so that students start reading skips and steps in one exercise. Side note, there are a lot of games and resources that drill in single notes, right? They're a good start once again. But here's my charge to you. Don't hang out with these activities for very long. It's kind of similar to teaching alphabet letters, A, B, C, for example, to preschoolers without really introducing sight words. It's helpful somewhat, but it's not productive for long-term reading success. It's very similar to reading music. In fact, I often say this thing, don't stay single for too long. I'm talking about notes, not your personal life. Intervals really do matter, and that's where the real sight reading begins. So let me show you NoteQuest Interval Selector. So take a look. Okay, here's the main menu, note class. I'm going to play real piano, and I'm going to select intervals at the top. By the way, this menu is going to look completely different soon, so look out for that. Seconds and thirds mix out of all these choices is what we're going to do. So this really makes the student discriminate between skips and steps. And that's what it looks like. Lastly, this is something that you probably already do, especially if you're involved in music examinations. This is the classic ear training exercise where you recognize intervals by ear and maybe also their interval quality. Here's an example of me doing interval ear training with my online student who's out of state. Side note, since some of you might ask me, what am I using for a video platform? I've been using a platform called Musicology, and I must say that it's been a game changer for the students I teach online. And I also want to mention that Chelsea is not your everyday student. She's pretty gifted, but I wanted to still show you this reminder that ear training is vitally important, and it can easily be done and should be done semi-regularly to exercise critical listening skills. That will be very helpful for them to learn music reading later. Next.
Perfect fourth.
Perfect fourth.
Major sixth.
Yes. What's next after intervals? The next natural progression would be to introduce directional reading, and that's what you see here. It's just a series of a few pitches that are meant to be rhythmless, and it's really for the student to be able to practice the distance from note to note instead of looking at each pitch as an individual thing. So here's a great example from the primer level of NoteFit, and NoteFit is found inside of NoteQuest app. It's the sight reading section. So here we see a series of just 4 pitches, and these are all based on middle C, reinforcing those landmarks. The next set you'll find in G, and so on. So these are focused on the landmarks. Now, when the student plays this, all they have to do to check themselves or their accuracy is to tap the screen and listen. And now they're using their ears. So this is a really great way to provide a bridge from note recognition and intervals and into an actual sight reading process. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't say a word or two about rote teaching. Many of you are already familiar with what it is and have incorporated it already. It is a beautiful way to integrate the ear, the eyes, and the hands. Rote can easily enhance a student's intervallic awareness by ear and by touch. Paula Dreyer and Samantha Coates both have excellent resources related to rote teaching, and I highly recommend that you check them out. Some rote naysayer teachers don't realize that it can actually serve as a bridge towards sight reading improvement. It doesn't have to be treated as a cheat. It is demonstration and repetition and patterning, and it's something that I would really look into. I realized I packed a bunch of information into this short presentation. I tried my best to keep it as to the point and concise as possible. I hope that it's been helpful to you and that you've gained at least a couple of ideas that you will consider and explore. When you consider multisensory experiences in a music lesson, you're producing a more rich learning space for your diverse students. I would love to know if you have suggestions or tips that have worked well for you. Personally, I would also love to know if you've tried any of these tips and how well they worked. Please contact me through my website. I'm going to post it on the screen here. It's notequest.net. If you have any questions about any of these ideas, or if you have any feedback for me, I will be happy to email you my video links and notes from this talk today. Thank you so much for watching.